Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is June 5th, 2017, and we're very, very excited to have with us someone that I've known for quite some time. His name is Derrick Clements. And before we jump into our discussion with Derrick on the topic of ethically navigating the middle way of Mormonism, that's the title that we're giving it. I'll just add a few announcements, and then we'll dive right in. So, as many of you know, there are several events that we have planned and organized over the past several months or so. You can go to mormonstories.org/events to see the event calendar. These are workshops and retreats, mostly for people who are some way navigating a faith or religious transition within a Mormon context. The first that we have is July 7th through 8th in Dallas, Texas. We'll be doing a full 2-day retreat. We're really excited about that. We're planning a fireside one of those nights as well that we'll be getting some information out soon on. So if you're anywhere in the Texas or surrounding states and you want to spend a good 2 days with others who are trying to work out their Mormon transition, we'd love you to join us. August 11th through 12th, we'll be doing something very special. It's a mixed faith marriage retreat. Dr. Julie Diaz-Avedo-Hanks will be joining me. If you are in a mixed faith marriage, or if you know someone who is, it'll be 2 days of content specifically oriented towards those in a mixed faith marriage, and it'll be split down the middle. So half believers and active, half non-believers or semi-active or non-active. So we're really excited about that. Please do join us if you can. There will be karaoke. September 14th and 15th will be in Seattle. October 20th through 22nd will be in Sydney, Australia. We're really excited about that. November 9th through 10th will be in San Francisco Bay Area. And if you really like to plan ahead, we're planning a Mormon Stories cruise based on listener demand and requests. We're planning a cruise to the Bahamas in October of 2018. We've already got several people signed up, even though it's that far out. We're going to have a blast. So please check out mormonstories.org/events if you want to join us for any of those events. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at openstoriesfoundation@gmail.com. So those are our announcements. We're really excited for all those who are joining us live on Facebook Live. And now I'm going to introduce our first guest, or our only guest for today. His name is Derrick Clements. Again, it's June 5th. Derrick, you've been a listener to Mormon Stories or the OSF podcast for quite some time. But if you don't mind, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself really quick to our audience, and then we'll talk about our topic.
So my name is Derrick Clements, as you said, and let's see, I live in Provo. I work for the Daily Herald newspaper, where I cover arts and entertainment. I do a number of podcasts on my own. I do a podcast about Pixar. I'm a big movie fan and a Pixar fan, and I actually just started helping out Gina Colvin on her Thoughtful Faith podcast. We started a new series called the Cheeky Mormon Movie Review. We've done a few movie reviews on that so far. It's been pretty fun. But yeah, I'm married, and my wife's name is Katie, and that's a little bit about me.
All right. Yeah, so I think it's worth mentioning your time at Radiolab, because I'm sure there's a lot of listeners who think Radiolab's super cool.
I'm one of them. I think Radiolab is great. Yeah. A couple of years ago, I went to New York for the summer while I was still a student at BYU toward the end of my college career there. And it was an intern. It was great. It was a really, really cool experience, and got to meet some really great people, learn about radio, and it was fantastic.
And tell us about Pixar Podcast and just a little bit about what that's about and what type of audience it has and how that's been for you.
Yeah, well, it's funny, John, and I'll remember way back when I first found your podcast, Mormon Stories. It was one of the first podcasts that I found back in 2005, 2006, something like that. And I was like, oh, I want to do a podcast. And I think I even sent you an email. I don't know if you remember. I sent you an email. I was like, I don't even remember what I asked you, but I asked you some kind of question about like tips for podcasting, and you were really generous and gave me some good tips, and it was really helpful. But then it wasn't until a few years later that I actually decided I'm really going to do this. So I started a podcast. I called it the Pixar Podcast. The intent was just to talk about Pixar buzz and news and stuff like that, of upcoming movies. And then it ended up getting listened to by some Pixar animators who expressed interest in it. And I was like, oh, wow. So I started interviewing them, and then it kind of, the show morphed from there to a interview show mainly. So I try to incorporate some audio documentary aspects, kind of Radiolab style, but covering Pixar movies. I've gone to Pixar a number of times since then with the podcast. They've invited me out to cover press events and things like that. Actually, this Saturday, I'm going to be going down to Southern California covering an event for Cars 3. So it's kind of a really fun hobby that's taught me a lot of skills, but it's also an outlet for my passions, which I guess you know something about as well with podcasting.
Do they like pay for your expenses and fly you out and stuff?
Yeah, so when they have junkets at Pixar, Disney will pay for it. This time they didn't pay for it, but they invited me, and they threw in a couple of tickets to Disneyland. So I'm like, all right, yeah, that sounds pretty good. I guess Katie and I will drive down and have a nice weekend in Southern California.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, Derrick, you're doing great stuff, and it's been great to have you as kind of a cyber friend over the years.
Yeah.
All right, so let's dig into the genesis of this interview.
Okay.
And I'll probably be a little bit vulnerable here because this kind of touches on some areas that are close to my heart and probably a little raw.
Okay.
So I spent, obviously I had my faith crisis back in 2000, 2001, and noticed how many people were struggling because of different aspects of the church. And that led me to leave Microsoft and start Mormon Stories. And the whole purpose of Mormon Stories really was to alleviate suffering. And of course, as soon as the podcast started, people started reaching out to me to tell me about divorces or depression or even suicidality because of the ways that kind of Mormonism can go bad. The weird thing for me is I never left Mormonism because it was bad for me. I felt like it was good for me, and I actually loved it. And even to the very end, they had to kick me out. I didn't really want to leave because that's just been my experience. But I did realize there was so much pain out there that along the way I got my PhD and wanted to study how to help people who were experiencing things like divorce or depression or anxiety, or just a faith crisis. And it's just been kind of overwhelming and a little bit suffocating to be continually plugged into that audience of the people that, frankly, the church hurts, or the church culture or the church people hurts in some way. And of course, there are the arguments that all organizations do harm, and I understand that. But being tapped into this pain and anger so continually sometimes causes me to kind of, or allow it to cause me to kind of do an outburst on the internet. And I would just say a few weeks or a month ago, I'm losing track of time, I ended up posting something that I post probably every year, at least once, with a little bit of an addendum. And I basically said something to the effect of, let's just be honest, there are four types of people that remain active in the Mormon Church, given all the evidence that the church isn't what it claims to be, whether it's the Book of Mormon and its historicity, whether it's the changing first vision narratives, whether it's the racism, sexism, homophobia. There are lots of different reasons. The Book of Abraham, you could just decide that the church wasn't true. I think the evidence is overwhelming. That's my opinion. And so I basically made the assertion on Facebook that there are four types of people who remain in the church. The first group are people who are unaware of the problems. So, I'd say that's the majority of Mormons. And that's just people who don't know about the multiple accounts of the first vision, who don't know about the polyandry, who don't know about the Book of Mormon historicity problems or the Book of Abraham problems. And so if we're not being kind, we can call them fooled, or we can call them unaware. But that's the first group that I kind of asserted are active in the church. The second group I asserted are those who are unable to leave without some sort of massive disruption in their lives. And so that can be people who, let's just say they're in a marriage where if they leave the church, they'll be threatened with divorce. This is real. This happens all the time, and I see it all the time. Or maybe they have a job where their financial income is tied to Mormonism in some way, and it would be a massive financial hit if they left. Or, they don't want to disappoint their parents, or, something that kind of leaves them trapped in the church. That's the second group. The third, and this is again, I'm admitting that this is sort of going to be perceived as insulting by many who listen, but I hope you'll bear with me, because the purpose of this podcast is to challenge my assertions and to give an example of someone who basically defies, or at least claims to defy, these assertions. So please don't stay offended. Please bear with me as I talk about this. But the third category I'm saying are those who are just basically unsympathetic to the people the church harms. So maybe they're aware of the problems. Maybe they aren't in a situation where they're kind of trapped and have to stay, but they just sort of say, you know what? Yeah, it sucks that the church harms gay and lesbian people. It sucks that the church, it maybe isn't great for women, but on the balance, it works for me. It's good for me. And so I'm maybe not as sympathetic to the people that the church harms. It works for me. It makes me feel better. It enriches my life. So that'd be the third group. And then the fourth group, and this is something that my dear cousin Greta and others, Wendy Montgomery and others, have sort of reminded me of over the years. It's this group of people who maybe don't believe the church is what it claims to be. And I'm not speaking specifically of Greta or any of those people, but I'm just saying in general, they kind of are aware of the problems. Maybe they don't view the church as being what it claims to be. Maybe they could leave and it wouldn't be a massive disruption. Maybe even they, maybe their life would be simpler in some ways if they left. And maybe they are deeply sympathetic to the people that the church harms. And that is the reason why they stay. They stay because they want to be a part of improving a church that harms people. And I would say it's probably a combination of they get something out of it, whether it's socially or familial or even spiritual, but also they stay to improve the church. So that's sort of a structure or framework that I put together in frustration to try and grapple with how some people remain in the church. And Derrick lovingly and patiently and sweetly challenged me on that Facebook post. And he basically said, hey, John, those categories are, number one, maybe not kind or charitable. And number two, they don't fit me. They don't quite capture my experience. And there were several other people, Jerry Renshaw and others, Greta again, who just said, John, you're kind of missing something. And so I'm tired of having this war on Facebook. What I thought I'd do is bring Derrick on and talk about it. And so that's, Derrick, why we're here.
Yeah.
We're here to discuss all that. Do you want to jump? Yeah, I don't want to start dealing with the issues because I want to jump back and tell a little bit about your story first.
Okay.
But is there anything you want to jump in and say, maybe to correct the history or the lead up to this podcast?
No, I liked hearing that again. Yeah. And I think you did a good job summarizing the Facebook post, and thank you for inviting me on. When you asked me to come on, I was like, gosh, do I really have anything interesting to say? But I would love to talk, and I'm excited to dive into that stuff with you. So yeah, let's do it.
Beautiful. All right. We've got a lot of live listeners. We actually have 107 people joined us live right now. A lot of people from Waka. So Jana says, yay, Waka friends. Andrea writes, where's your shirt from, Derrick? So I'm just going to throw out.
Well, I said I'm a big Pixar fan, and I'm wearing a kind of like I think of it as like a Toy Story shirt because it's got a bunch of like cacti on it. I'm trying to remember. I think I got it like at H&M or something. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I love it. So thanks, listeners, for those who have posted questions. We love your questions, your comments. Please do post them, and I will make sure to do my best to incorporate those that I can. And of course, the wonderful Amy Grubbs is moderating the comments in case people get nasty, because occasionally that happens. All right, Derrick. So let's go back.
Okay.
And let's give us the 1 to 2 minute background of your Mormon history, your Mormon upbringing.
Sure. So I was born in California, in Lodi, California. I grew up in Stockton, California. And I was more into a Mormon family. I'm the youngest of 6 kids. Was Mormon my whole life, and was pretty happy as a Mormon my whole life. Went to BYU at 18 or 17 or 18 years old, and as I mentioned earlier, I discovered podcasts, and your Mormon Stories was, I think, 1 episode in or 2 episodes in when I first heard it. There were a couple of other Mormon related. I just typed in Mormon in iTunes and saw what came up. There were a couple others that came up, and I had been aware of things like Sunstone and other types of things, but in my head, the Sunstone was something that I shouldn't read, or there was something that was, I knew there was some kind of stigma attached to it. It also, like, I wasn't interested in learning about negative things about the church per se, but I also considered myself an open-minded person. So I was like, yeah, I mean, whatever. I want to test my faith, and I'm fine with criticism. And something that really appealed to me about your podcast in particular, John, was how you were just like, let's just investigate. Let's just openly discuss issues. And so there were a number of things that I learned about from Mormon Stories that were really challenging to my faith, but invigorating to my life. And
how old were you in 2005?
So I was, let's see. So this would have been, I think it was early 2006 when I started, and I would have been 18.
So would this have been pre-mission? Did you serve a mission?
Yeah. So this is pre-mission. Yeah.
Okay.
So it was a freshman at BYU, and I remember hearing one of your first podcasts. Maybe it was the first one. You told your story about your mission experience in Guatemala, right?
That's right.
And about some missionaries that would baptize really young children, including some that were younger than 8. And I was just sick. All my friends were going on missions at this time. I was getting ready to put my papers in, and that made me seriously not want to go on a mission. It made me seriously question whether I wanted to invest in the church. And I felt like at that young age, even though my whole life had been devoted to the church, or had been affiliated with the church, and it wouldn't have been easy to leave per se, but it would have been, I kind of felt like I hadn't yet made big commitments to the church. And so I was happy that I was learning some of these more complicated, difficult issues, because what it did for me is it allowed me to, I don't know, a little bit more openly make a choice. And so I ended up trying to learn as much as I could about various controversial aspects of the church. And it led me at that time to a lot of reflection and study of scripture as well as non-scripture type stuff about Mormonism. And it was a really, I would say, spiritually invigorating time of my life. This idea and something that like I've come to experience throughout my life is that this experience of disillusionment and disenchantment can be a breaking open into something deeper and more beautiful. And so that
when you were serving your mission, did you consider yourself an Orthodox believer? Were you like doubting your faith as a missionary? What was that like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was doubting my faith before my mission, and I've always been comfortable with my doubts, or like make home with my doubts ever since then. But things have changed. I mean, that was 10 years ago or whatever, however it was. And there's various different kind of touchstones throughout my Mormon story. That first breaking open, I was still quite literal thinking. I'm less so now. But then, so yeah, throughout my mission, I wouldn't say that I had a lot of doubts, but I would say that I was aware that the church and that church leaders and that missionaries could be mistaken and could do. I was always trying to be cautious as a missionary, that I wasn't going to fall into the traps that I had heard about of, manipulation and tactics of focusing on numbers all the time.
So would you say I know the church is true as a missionary?
Yes.
And kind of this is the one true church kind of rhetoric. Would that be a part of your missionary work?
I'm not sure that has ever really resonated with me that much, because again, recognizing that the church wasn't perfect. I mean, kind of learning that was a thing that I learned, that, the church, because I'd always say as a teenager or whatever, the people are not perfect, but the church is perfect. And pretty quickly before my mission, I was like, oh, actually the church isn't perfect and church leaders aren't perfect. And so I think that, but I definitely was of the mindset as a missionary that probably the Mormon church was the best church. And that's another thing that I probably don't feel as much now. Okay.
But probably not knee deep in the polyandry, historicity stuff as a missionary, probably.
I mean, I was open to the idea that the Book of Mormon could be not a historical document. And I was definitely aware that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, and also that there were, in my view, not the greatest, like some creepy stuff, right?
Okay.
So I felt like I was aware of some of those issues, but I've never become like a huge scholar in any of those things, really.
Okay. But you made it through your mission without some major breakdown. You had a successful mission. Happy mission.
And in fact, all that stuff really helped my mission, I would say, because there were a couple of touchstones to my faith at that point where I was like, okay, my faith is about my relationship with God and about trying to access something that's greater than even the church. And how can I do that? So that mindset really helped me to connect with people and enjoy my mission quite a lot. So I really had a good experience with that.
And again, where'd you go? Tell us again.
I went to Brazil.
Brazil. Okay. So you're Portuguese speaking.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So fast forward from your mission to now, just briefly characterize if you've changed at all.
Well, I would say the one thing that was the biggest, again, this thing of disillusionment, I think, is not just something that happens once. It happens various times. And so there were various things that happened after my mission. The most immediate one was when my best friend, Carrie, and he was also my roommate, came out to me. And before our missions, Carrie and I had talked a lot about...
Came out as gay.
Came out as gay. Yeah. Okay. And we talked often about like before our missions, like, man, it would be really hard to be gay and Mormon. And when he finally came out to me, he was like, Derrick, remember when we talked about all those things that time? Like, I assumed you knew, because I would say things like, yeah, it is hard. and I just didn't notice that was what he was saying. But that coming out really I don't know, it again threw me into a place of, I need to really figure out what I think, because I voted. I'm from California. I mentioned I voted for Proposition 8 that would ban California. I voted for Prop 8 and Obama in the same ticket, right? And I didn't think about it as much until, again, that following year. It was kind of one of those hypothetical things where it's like, oh yeah, like that doesn't really make sense. Like I would kind of not like it, but I would be like, I didn't really think about it. I came from this kind of privileged position and didn't really think about it. And yeah, anyway. Do
you regret voting for it now?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
okay.
Definitely.
So if it came up again, you would not vote for
Absolutely. Yeah, okay. Definitely. But so that again just kind of made me question, like, okay, before my mission, I became comfortable with the idea that prophets maybe were wrong in the past. I was of the opinion back then that the race and the temple ban and the priesthood ban was wrong. But there wasn't really anything of current policy or doctrine that I had a problem with until Carrie came out to me, and I was like, okay, yeah, I actually don't agree with it. So that took however much time to figure out. And then I would say probably the next big thing, I may be forgetting something, but probably the next big thing is the policy change of 2015, where I had been, because I've been active in all this time and just feeling like the church is imperfect, and I'm a Mormon, and this is, there's things about it that I don't like, but there's things about it that I love. And, but then the policy change was like, gosh, I really disagree with this policy change. And that was, I don't know. I actually, when that happened, I mean, that was many years later than what we've been talking about, but I called Carrie on the phone and I was like, I wanted to ask him specifically, like, can I be Mormon? Like, what do you think? Like, how would you feel? And I mean, it's not that I should place everything on his sort of moral authority, but I really wanted to know his perspective. And we had a conversation, and he kind of relayed to me that, like, yeah, I would be sad if you weren't Mormon. And I think you can do good things from within the church, and you can be Mormon. And I was like, okay. So that was kind of how that conversation went. But yeah, that's, I guess those are kind of the main. Oh, another kind of interesting thing, and I've actually told this story live at kind of a comedy show that we were part of, John, but I didn't watch R-rated movies until I was in my early 20s, because it was one of those things where I was like, I believe that a prophet has said you shouldn't watch R-rated movies, and I wanted to follow the prophet. And so the very first R-rated movie that I saw, I was like in my early 20s, and it was The King's Speech, and I felt very much like God was okay with it. I felt very much like it was one of these moments in my life, and I've written about it in a forthcoming book we're doing a book about Mormons and movies. But anyway, that was another touchstone, because now, as I said, I'm a movie fan. Now I watch a lot of movies and tons of movies, but that was another big touchstone in my life.
Okay. So there's never been a time where you've like totally gone inactive or had this massive faith crisis where you just decided the church wasn't true and harmed too many people and wanted to leave?
Right. I've always kind of felt like it would be a possibility that I could leave, but I've always felt committed to the church and committed to the community and the culture that I'm a part of, and to the part of my own identity that is Mormon. And so yes, it's never, I've always gone to church, and I've always had callings, and for a lot of this time, actually, I was employed by the MTC. I was an MTC teacher for a number of years, about 4 years after my mission, and I taught Institute pretty recently when I was single. So I've been very active in participating, and I've always had a rule of thumb of not saying things that I don't believe. So in these settings where I'm teaching, or where I think that's something that a lot of people that I've talked to get burnt out, because they're in this cognitive dissonance space where they are saying things that they're uncomfortable with. So for me, like teaching Institute, for example, sometimes those lessons were really difficult to prepare, because I'd have to draw what I can fully get behind and what I can fully say with integrity. And how can I possibly avoid certain subjects? How can I, focus on things that I feel impressed to focus on? So that's kind of been one way that I've managed, I guess, is just being very committed to the idea of don't lie, don't say anything that you don't
believe. That's great. I think that's important. All right, let's pause for a second and incorporate some of the comments from our listeners.
Okay.
Oswaldo is joining us from Peru. Oswaldo writes, I remain active in the church because I have received a testimony directly from God about it, but I'm very disappointed with the LDS Church in my country, Peru. I would like to continue living in Peru, but that my, I think, certificate of membership be assigned to a ward in Salt Lake City where all the priesthood leaders are faithful members, ideally 6th generation faithful LDS. That's interesting. So Oswaldo, thanks for sharing that perspective. I wonder to what extent, that would be true. All right. Anthony writes, I didn't have any idea about any of these things as a missionary. I think Anthony's meaning the historical truth claim stuff.
Sure.
I do think that would be challenging to be a missionary, knowing all the difficult things. Melissa writes, hello from a former Mormon and former ward choir member of Derricks. So
yeah.
Melissa, a shout out from Melissa. A different Melissa writes, I think it's amazing how now how so much information is available via the internet and podcasts. Our young people are so fortunate to have all this info about the church. She says she just eyed blindly as a youth for 25 plus years ago. Anthony writes, my wife can easily dismiss Brigham Young, but can't go any further. So that's interesting when people sort of like are willing to draw a line and say, yeah, Brigham was full of crud and Joseph was messed up, but everything after that's good.
Right.
That's interesting. Chrissy writes that you were a phenomenal MTC teacher, Derrick.
Oh, that's very nice.
Thanks. So I don't know if you remember Chrissy. Might have been Sister Wilson at the time, maybe.
Okay.
Okay, so
and I have to shout out too. I loved being a ward choir director. That was really, really fun. I would bake bread and bring it to the ward choir, and I have really good memories of that period.
Good. All right, Melissa. I'll read one more. Melissa writes, "There's a third position in any organization," and I think she's talking about people who are in an Orthodox or maybe out. She says there's a third position, those who are at the edge of the inside. These people are within the organization, but they're not subsumed by the groupthink. They work at the boundaries, bridges, and entrance ways. Would you say that characterizes you, Derrick, or not so much?
Yeah, I that resonates a lot with me. I mean, I think, that makes sense to my brain.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think that gives us a sense for your journey. And I do think that's unique that someone could be a Mormon Stories listener since 2006 and retain commitment in the church. I mean, I know there's a lot of you out there, but I haven't had a lot of conversations with you on the podcast. So this is interesting to me. I'm excited to kind of dig in.
Cool.
All right, Derrick. So what I think I'll do, if it's okay, is I'll go back and I'll read through my categories.
Yeah, great.
And I want you to, you talked about honesty being really important. So I want you to honestly assess the 4 categories.
Yeah.
And then we're going to dig into your beliefs and your practices as an active middle way Mormon and just talk about how you do it. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
And I want to encourage listeners to provide their feedback. All right. So category 1 is those who are unaware of the problems, or an uncharitable way to characterize that would be people who have been fooled. Obviously, you don't fit into that category. Do you agree that a lot of people, that maybe the bulk of Mormons fit in this category? Would you characterize it in a more charitable way? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know that I have an opinion on the bulk of Mormons, but I think to a certain degree, I fit into all 4 categories. I think the 4 things that you listed all sound like some aspect of my experience at various times. I think the overall criticism that I would have sort of had, or that I gave, was that I didn't feel like any one in particular or all of them together summed up, was the whole experience of it. But yeah, when I was younger, I was unaware of a lot of things, and I'm still unaware of many, many things. So I definitely have, and there's systematic things with this, right? There's things that the church has consciously decided as an institution in its curriculum to avoid talking about. And so that's something that is somewhat changing, very slowly changing, and I think in a positive direction. But the idea that there are people that are Mormon who are unaware of negative and complicated and morally ambiguous or downright morally wrong aspects, I think there are many reasons why Mormons might be unaware. And so, yeah, I think that definitely is true.
Okay. Yeah, and I think tell me if you agree that if we were able to grab the attention of every Mormon out there in the whole world and said, hey, there's 5 things you should know, and we told them, Joseph had 30 wives, and, a bunch of them were married to other men at the time, and he lied about it. That's point 1. Point 2 is, anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, and plagiarisms and stuff. And then part 3 is the Book of Abraham and the translation stuff, and the peepstone in the hat, and the Joseph didn't look at the plates, and and the racism, both in the Book of Mormon and, with the African Americans. And we just kind of went through, there'd be a lot of people shocked, wouldn't you say?
I think so, although I do think that that's favoring the intellectual aspect of it. I think that a lot of people are Mormon because of something else, and I think a lot of people leave Mormonism because of something else too. Those historical problems and those intellectual issues with the faith. I'm not so sure how many Mormons experience Mormonism intellectually as opposed to somewhere else in their body, and so I think that's important to point out too.
No, that's a great point, Derrick. I do think that conversion is an emotional experience, and I think retention is an emotional and a social experience. I think pretty much most, if not all religions, you have an emotional conversion and a social conversion, and that's what keeps you. Yeah. So what I'm more kind of saying is that sometimes learning these details can be enough to sort of jar someone and have them say, okay, I feel good at church and the people are nice, but if this is really our history, then that doesn't square. No, number one, I haven't been told the truth, and number two, this is a problem. If Joseph was lying about, being married to 30 women and a bunch of them were teenagers, I can't, So you can understand that even though people's conversion or retention or participation are emotional or spiritual and social, would you acknowledge that those intellectual issues could become stumbling blocks for many people if they were made aware of them?
I mean, based on my experiences and friends, yes, definitely. And also, so could social structures and people of color and people with various gender identities or sexual identity, sexual orientations. Those things have nothing to do, those aspects of the person's identity have nothing to do with those intellectual issues. But I think that maybe even more than the intellectual issues, the ability that the church or the current makeup of the church's infrastructure, I think, can also, there's many stumbling blocks, intellectual, social.
Yep. And we'll talk about those groups in point 3.
Okay.
So the second, and I love that you framed that you're in all these. I think we are in all these.
Yeah.
But I agree that they don't capture everyone's experience. So I think it's important that we're having this dialogue.
Cool.
So the second group that I see all the time, it's a dentist or an orthodontist or a business person who, has a business tied to Mormonism, and they're worried. Let's just say they live in Utah, and they're worried if I leave the church, it'll be a massive financial disruption, or their spouse will leave them, or they'll disappoint their parents, or they'll lose all their friends. And so in some sense, they feel I've got no choice. I just have to fake it. I have to lie, and I have to hide what I really think and feel because the disruption in my life would be too significant. Do you personally know people like that who are in that situation?
Yeah, well, I think I've known missionaries that have taken that approach, that maybe other missionaries who were uncomfortable with various aspects of the church, but just kind of decided, I'm just gonna fake it till you make it kind of thing. And I've seen that be harmful to a person's inner happiness. And I think that can be a really uncomfortable position to be in. I also experienced that to one degree in myself of as an employee of the MTC, I had to have a temple recommend. And so, there was never any contradiction that would have prevented that for me personally. But I was acutely aware of the discomfort that I felt about that. Because frankly, I loved working at the MTC, and I considered pursuing, I had opportunities and considered to pursue, maybe I should just stay there at the MTC and have my career with the church. But as much as I loved it, I was uncomfortable with the idea of building a life and a career and a livelihood on my religious faith. So, because anything can happen, right? You could believe different things at any point. So I was uncomfortable with that kind of, I didn't want to put myself in a corner in that way. So that's kind of Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just say, I see this all the time. I had one of my podcast listeners who reached out to me. He was in a bishopric, and he felt over time that he'd be lying if he continued being in the bishopric, because he didn't really believe anymore, and felt like he was misrepresenting something that he couldn't support. So he told his wife that he no longer believed, and she literally said, "I want a divorce," like as the immediate reaction. And his reaction was to say, "Okay, well, I'm going to go back and hide and lie and stay in the bishopric and just say things I don't believe, because I love my wife and I love my children." And I see this maybe on a weekly basis. And so that's the foundation of my category.
Yeah.
And so, you said you can relate to it. Maybe you haven't seen that in your own life as much.
Yeah, I can relate to it. I'm actually, John, I'd love to ask you a question if I could.
Sure.
Do you feel that way at all because I have a lot of sympathy for like people in the church office building, or people, that are tied, their careers are tied, their lives are based on this spiritual work. And you kind of fit into that category too. I mean, what would happen if you decided, I just don't care about Mormonism anymore. I don't want to do this. I mean, that would kind of be disruptive in your life, wouldn't it? It's kind of a similar way.
No, that's a great question. The truth is, and sometimes I get in trouble for saying this, is I had a super lucrative career prior to doing Mormon Stories. As you know, I worked for Microsoft, and then I worked for MIT, and I could be doing very, very well with very happy, fulfilling jobs. I saw too many Frank Capra movies when I was at BYU. And one of the Frank Capra movies I saw was called You Can't Take It With You. Okay. And the main theme of that movie is, what's the point of living if you can't love and enjoy and believe in what you do?
Yeah.
And so I feel, and I could be self-deluded, I feel like I'm very principle or ethically driven in what I do. Yeah. I feel like I've personally experienced the suffering and the difficulty of a transition. Now I've witnessed it with tens of thousands of people. And so I'm committed to helping people and supporting people in that transition. So in some sense, yes, I've invested now 12 years and a PhD and a master's degree in instructional technology in this field. But I can tell you, here's my answer to you, Derrick. Yeah. If at some point I decided that I felt like we weren't doing good, there wasn't a need, or that I was doing more harm than good, I'm the type of personality where I would become depressed and broken if I kept doing it.
Yeah.
And so I don't, so maybe it would be hard to transition at age 47 to a completely different field. But the truth is, I've got a PhD in the equivalent of 2 masters. I've got a lot of technical skills. I've got a lot of friends. I think I could carve out a new career.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm self-deluded, but I think I'm doing this because I believe in it. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that answers my question. And I think that a lot of people, I mean, I'm of the generation where people don't stick with careers for a long time, right? I mean, I think that there's a sort of secular metaphor for this particular point on your list of like when disruptive things come into our brains and into our lives, it can shake up a whole bunch of things, relationships, careers, a lot of things can make it really hard when disillusionment or disruption happens of various kinds.
Yeah. But I love that you asked the question and ask me more.
Okay, cool.
Let's tune into some listener comments. Melissa writes, "We have a friend who secretly talks to us about the church's truth claims. If the spouse found out, a divorce would happen. So sad." So Melissa's saying she knows someone who falls in that category. Barbara writes, "I faked belief until I finally knew I had to be true to myself. Life eventually became much better, made new like-minded friends." So that's what Barbara experienced. Davey writes, "I'm another equally long-time Mormon Stories listener, and Derrick is my bestie." So you know Davey.
Yes, definitely.
Davey says, "I've had the opposite experience of many of my friends who have left the church. I totally understand leaving the church over all kinds of historical, ethical, theological, cultural, or any other kinds of issues, and I honor and respect that choice. I think every person's life takes a different path to God, whatever God is. My experience, however, was that once I started to learn about Mormon history and Joseph Smith, that's when I got excited about Mormonism. I'd grown up with the whitewashed version of Mormonism, and that was problematic. He writes, more messy and exciting and dangerous and true to my own experience with spirituality in all those ways. That's a really interesting perspective. So for Davey, learning about the mess was validating because Davey experienced a messy existence. And so it was in some ways invigorating and affirming. And that's, what do you think about Davey's response, Derrick?
I love that. And I think in particular, there's so many things I think this is part, maybe what he's getting at too, that Joseph Smith was this kind of radical thinker in a lot of ways, and was this great socialist and this open-minded and open-hearted kind of person, sometimes to a fault. And I think there's a lot of exciting and fringier aspects that are in our Mormon history that church curriculum has brushed away or has emphasized less. But I've heard other people as well echo what Davey has said. People that are both active and inactive be like, yeah, there's so much to our early stories that are exciting, and there's a BYU professor that I've heard talk about that as well. Yeah, I love that perspective.
Yeah, I'll read one more really quick. Tracy writes, I think it's so sad when a spouse tells their partner divorce is on the table when they lose their testimony of the gospel. Why can't some people separate their love for their life partner with their love of their religion? Tracy, it's a great question. I'll just say, when people get married, there's a contract within Mormonism, which is you will be committed to the church. And in some ways, Christ in the gospel becomes the intermediary between the couple and the marriage. And so the answer to your question is, when somebody breaks that contract, it's devastating to the believer. And they basically say, I want to go to the celestial kingdom. I want all my kids in the celestial kingdom. And you broke the contract. And so if you're not going to take me and our kids to the celestial kingdom, I'll find a worthy person who will. It's actually a consistent mindset. It's one that makes perfect sense. It's just super tragic, I think. What do you think, Derrick?
Yeah, it's really sad. In those situations, I just can't imagine how difficult that would be. I think it's really unfortunate.
Yeah. Okay. The third category that I listed, as we jousted a little bit online, and let me pull it up really quickly. The third category is those who are unempathetic to the church, to those that the church harms. So, of course, we know that if you're LGBT, at best you've got a 30% chance of remaining in the church, because the church in some ways has declared war on LGBT people, or at least LGBT people who want to be in loving, committed same-sex relationships. If you're a feminist and it really bothers you that men pretty much lead and govern and control the church for the most part, that can feel damaging. If the sexual messages that the church puts on youth and on women and on young boys bothers you, that can cause a lot of pain and sadness. Or if you're a person of color and you find your skin color to be denigrated or talked about as dark and as loathsome or as a sign of wickedness, it makes sense why there aren't a bunch of educated people of color flocking to Mormonism. It makes sense that LGBT people leave. It makes sense that feminists, tend to leave the church probably more than stay. But what do you make? What sense do you make, Derrick, of the people who know about the LGBT suicides, who know about the ways the church harms women, who know about the racism, and they just decide it works for me? Is there, this is a really tough category, but is there a group of Mormons who are active that are just like, yeah, it sucks for all those people, but it works for me, so I'm staying?
Yeah, and one caveat I would say, I might disagree with you. I think there are a bunch of people of color that are educated that are Mormon too, for various complicated reasons.
But I said flocking to the church. So yeah,
okay.
if you're raised in it, if somehow you were brought into it, but I wouldn't say there are a lot of educated people of color joining the church through missionary efforts. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, possibly. This is a tough, as you said, this is a tough one because I have to recognize that I fit in this category in some way, even though I spend a lot of my religious imagination and my spiritual imagination concerned with the people for whom the church doesn't fit very well, if at all. But even somebody like me who has spoken out in various public forums in support of LGBT issues and LGBT people, but like I'm a privileged person. So I think a big thing that this third question gets at is privilege, and the fact that I am who I am means that Mormonism isn't as difficult for me as it is for many other people. So I don't know, maybe there are some, even as you say, who are as callous as like, oh, I don't care about other people. And I mean, maybe that exists, but I think probably what's more common, and certainly what resonates with me, is recognizing that because of my privilege, I have an easier time. And so there are a number of, I don't know, I think that means something for the way that I engage with Mormonism. And it's something that I don't think I have a good answer to, but I try to wrestle with this because I have to.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you being vulnerable and honest and open about that. I'm not asserting that there's a bunch of Mormons out there that just are indifferent to the pain and suffering of others.
Okay.
But I think your comment about privilege really makes sense. If you're white, middle to upper class, educated, definitely male, straight, cisgender, if you have brothers and sisters and parents and ancestors all in the church, and it's where your social group is sort of tied, it's going to be a lot easier to remain Mormon. And those, the suffering of people of color, the suffering of LGBT people is probably going to be drowned out in some sense by all the benefits you get from being part of the institution.
Right.
And I know that you're not the type of person that just doesn't care about those people. And I know that you do. And I know that a lot of people, like my cousin Greta, she's passionately caring about LGBT people. And Whitney Montgomery talked to me about this too. They're in the pews every Sunday fighting for that LGBT youth, helping them feel loved and accepted and supported. And that takes us to the fourth category. But I'm just saying that I appreciate your acknowledgement that privilege plays an important role in one's ability to sort of assess the truth claims, assess the harm, and decide works enough for me that I'm going to stay engaged anyway.
Yeah, and one thing I think this leads to is something that I've been thinking about a lot with this idea of how the church works or doesn't work for me or for various other people. I'm not sure that I would say that I am involved in the church because it works for me. Like there's an assumption underneath that is my relationship with the church is based on something that I'm getting out of church. Because while I fit in many categories that make me privileged in church, I also, because of various beliefs that I have and sort of not very many lifestyle things, mostly beliefs, but I don't fit into like the super orthodox cookie cutter thing. So it's not necessarily that I don't like thinking about my participation as a Mormon as I get something out of it, whether it's spiritual or whether it's social. I tend to think of it more in terms of identity and just like coming in, being truly like harmonious with my integrity as who I am and figuring out what that means, who I am. So while I do think that question 3 or point 3 definitely applies, and I have to be very conscious of it, I also kind of want to undermine the premise of it, that is people should go to the church that fits best for them, because I probably don't go to the church that fits best for me. There are probably a whole host of churches that probably fit better with me, but that's not fully why I am Mormon, if that makes sense.
That's interesting. What I hear you kind of saying is that there's almost a tribal, cultural identity element, which is true, and it makes perfect sense, where it's like, it may not be easiest, it may not be the best fitting, but it's who I am. It's like family almost.
Yeah.
You don't, just because your dad may be not nice or you don't always get along with your siblings, you don't bail from your family.
Right.
we're tribal creatures. They say a lone monkey is a dead monkey.
Right.
You stay in your tribe, and there's loyalty and there's identity. Is that
exactly? That's exactly. And it's not just when I hear people talk about this, sometimes I bristle when it's simplified to community. It's not just that I like my ward. I like my ward. In fact, I really like my ward, but it's not just that I like my ward. And there's various aspects of wards that I've been in where I haven't really liked going to church. So it's not about the community per se, but it is, as you say, this deeper thing of identity, of looking inside myself, who I am, how I understand the world, how I see things. It's Mormon, and I'm Mormon. And so, yes, it goes deeper than just community.
I think that's a really important insight. And to be honest, I still feel that way. I still very much feel Mormon.
Yeah.
I love the hymns. I love the music. I love the people. I love the culture.
Yeah,
obviously
awesome.
I can't get enough of it. And I would even say the work I do is kind of is a sign of love for the Mormon people and my upbringing. So
totally. And I think people could be in the church and active in the church, going to church on Sundays with that attitude as I do, but also could be outside of the church and have that attitude. Identity is not something that other people can control. The identity comes from within, and it's not something that is. It's funny. I recently wrote a column because even though I'm an entertainment reporter, I also have an opportunity to write kind of about whatever I want every now and then at the newspaper here in Provo. And my most recent column that ran on a Sunday was about, I was just asserting that I believe it'd be great if prophets and apostles in the LDS Church could retire. And it kind of blew up the readership of the Daily Herald. There were a lot of people that were commenting, this guy says he's Mormon, but he's obviously not Mormon. And you can't question this is a policy that God himself instituted. And it's just, I find it very odd when other people that don't know me are trying to police my identity as a Mormon. But I understand it, and it happens all the time. But that was the time that it happened most recently for me, where it's like, people are saying I'm not Mormon. Okay, I'm not Mormon to you. I'm Mormon to the primary kids I work with every Sunday. I don't know.
Yeah, that's
and I'm not asserting to be a great Mormon or a good Mormon. I'm Mormon. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I love it. All right, Derrick, let's go to just a few comments from our listeners. Ashley writes, thanks for sharing your thoughts. So much of this resonates with me and why I choose to stay. So a positive shout out from Ashley. Thanks, Ashley. Stephen writes, church as identity is exactly right. When you grow up in a tradition and experience many good things, you can't just get divorced from it on an intellectual basis. I think that's why we're listening to an ex-Mormon talking about Mormonism. Joanna Brooks used to say, Mormonism doesn't wash off,
Yeah.
And that's true. I think it's true. That's why so many post-Mormons are still very Mormon, just in different ways.
Yeah.
Jessica writes, if only every Orthodox religious person could be as open-minded and fringe as these two men. The thing just moved. As these two men, but unfortunately, there are the exception. Well, Jessica, I don't think the church would be super healthy or strong if the church were made up of people just like me and Derrick.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because they need people to do all the other types of callings that probably Derrick and I wouldn't want to do.
We'd have really cool, I don't know. I don't know necessarily, but we'd have really cool discussions. I think we'd have good.
There'd be some fun things if anyone would show up.
Yeah.
Josh writes, I love the community and miss the community a lot. Something that I saw a little bit farther down, when we left, this is David, when we left, family chose church over family. It was and still is devastating. We are outsiders now, and no one respects us and fears us. It's really damaging. So, I do think it's, probably 1,000 years ago, you leave your tribe, you're dead.
Yeah.
Either they kill you or you're alone on the prairie and someone kills you. And in many ways, people experience a social and a familial death.
Yeah.
And I think we're in denial if we don't acknowledge that there's a real penalty for leaving the tribe. And there's a positive reason to want to be identified with the tribe, but there's also sometimes really severe punishments for leaving the tribe.
Yeah, definitely.
True?
Yeah, I would just say so. That makes sense. And
I
that's
mean,
another place that I'm privileged in that I have, great family members and stuff that I've never felt. I disagree with some of my family members on various aspects, but I'm lucky in that nobody has ever kind of threatened disowning me or anything like that. And I have a great marriage, and there's just a lot of ways that I'm privileged in this way.
do you feel like your spouse would be disappointed if you left the church?
I mean, it's kind of a complicated, yes and no. I mean, she'd have to come on and talk about it. We see very similarly in a lot of ways.
How about your parents and siblings? Would they be disappointed?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I don't know. I don't think they would ever stop loving me, and I think that they would always respect me. I think that some are disappointed now about how fringy I am. I don't know. And then others, I think, are really, really happy that I'm, as was mentioned earlier, kind of the fringe in group. So I don't know. I think certainly, but anyway. Yeah.
Could it affect your job if you just left the church? Could it affect your job, do you think?
I don't think so.
Your readership doesn't need Mormon writers necessarily.
No, I mean, I cover arts and entertainment. And I write in I do a lot of movie reviews, and people are sometimes comment. I commented. Sometimes people disagree with the ideology that I have underneath my reviews, and they say things like, this writer has a wrong worldview and things like that. I recently got a comment that was like, I'm not going to let my grandparents or parents or siblings read any more of your reviews. And there wasn't anything religious or anything in there. So I don't know why, but I mean, people will say what they're going to say, and I don't think it would affect.
Awesome. Okay. So let's talk quickly about the fourth category. And then I kind of want to dive into your particular lived experience for just a bit. I want to thank all the listeners for their comments. Oh, really quickly, this will just be like a break in the program. I made the announcements about the events at the beginning of the show. This interview with Derrick represents a little series that I'm doing. So we've had good experiences with the different series that we've done on Mormon Stories. So, for example, we did a series last year on missionaries who came home early from their missions. If you haven't checked out that series, it was phenomenal. It was brilliant. Recently, we did a series on the transgender experience within Mormonism. Wonderful people we've interviewed. We also did a series on people's experiences with general authorities that a lot of people really liked and valued. Derrick, my interview with you kicks off a series that I want to do on kind of, middle way Mormonism. So we hope to have some of the people from A Thoughtful Faith on, which is the support group on Facebook that supports people who are trying to make Mormonism work. Maybe Jerry Lee Renshaw, maybe Mark Crago, maybe others. We want to do that. We want to do a dive into apologetics, because apologetics is a significant way that people stay. There's a really sharp guy that I met recently named Bert Fuller, who has expressed a willingness to come on. He was engaged with the Maxwell Institute for quite a while and was really involved in Mormon apologetics, sort of at the BYU level. I want to have Bert on to talk about his experiences. And then finally, recently, there's this group called Faith Matters that faithmatters.org that did a little seminar at Utah State University on Joseph Smith and the translation process, where they're basically trying to more deeply explore what the word translation means as it relates to the Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, etc. And I'm hoping to bring on Jonathan Streeter, Jamie Hannes-Handy, and Bert Fuller to do a critique of that seminar, because I think it's important that we take a hard look at apologetics and whether it's ethical, etc. So that's going to be a series that we're kicking off with this interview, Derrick, and so I appreciate you coming on. I'll also do a quick shout out to the series that we've been doing on what we're calling Losing the Lamanites. So we've interviewed a brilliant woman from Brazil who grew up in Brazil and then immigrated to the United States, and we've done an interview with Hiram Joe, a Navajo who was raised in the church here in Utah. If you were raised being taught that you were a Lamanite and that your dark skin was due of a curse from a people that lived 1,000 years ago, who lived in America, or 2,000 years ago, and you don't love that part of your upbringing and the identity that was handed to you, we might be interested in having you on. So this is sort of a commercial break where I just kind of set up and introduce this series that we're having on Middle Way Mormonism with you, Derrick, but also let people know about past series and ongoing series. So any quick comments on that, Derrick? Have you checked out any of those episodes so far?
No, I haven't heard those, but I've been really impressed with stuff that Gina has done on that topic recently. She had a number of guests on discussing Native American perspectives and indigenous perspectives of Mormonism. I think, gosh, that's a perspective that I really want to hear, because their lived experience of Mormonism is different and interesting in many ways different from mine.
Yeah. All right. Well, Derrick, the last category is the category of people who are trying to stay in the church to alleviate or minimize the suffering caused by the church to the gays, feminists, intellectuals, people of color, etc. To what extent does that fit with you? Do you resonate with that, or not really?
I do, but kind of with some caveats, because I want to be a help in wherever I can, kind of in a theoretical way. And by speaking truthfully at all times, I feel like I am doing that. But I mean, that's not, yeah, I guess just what we've talked about so far. There's a whole host of reasons that one definitely resonates with me. I would hope that I can, when I was an institute teacher, I hoped that the perspective that I offered could be helpful to various people. And it is one reason why I stay Mormon.
Do you ever, for example, if something incorrect is said in Sunday school, correct it? If something homophobic is said, say, hey, we shouldn't, talk like that. Do you feel comfortable correcting members when they say something harmful or inaccurate?
Right. And I think that's a good question, because I don't know. I don't think as often as I wish I did. I don't know that it happens as often, like all that often necessarily, especially right now.
It's awkward, right?
Primary. Yeah,
it's awkward.
It's difficult.
It's painful. People don't like it. It makes you feel crappy.
Yeah. I'm also really comfortable letting people believe what they believe. And so it's not very often that I hear what I think is actually something actually harmful happening. And I don't know, I hope that I could have courage to speak up, and I hope that I could, but those things require social capital too. If it's going to be helpful, I think you have to have some level of, being able to be heard by the group. And again, because I'm a privileged person, I should be doing that probably more often than I am. It's something that I would like to have more courage to do. And I don't know. Yeah, it's on a one-on-one basis, I do it a lot more than like raising my hand in a group or so. I mean, if it's soft enough, I will do it, but it's hard to do it when it's really, really difficult. I think it's an easiest statement.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough to do. I never found a comfort level doing that. I just tended to stay quiet,
Yeah.
All right. So those are the four categories. And I think you've identified one major whole, which is just identity, tribal Mormons.
Yeah.
I think that's a significant failing in my framework, but I'm guessing that there's some other things that draw you to Mormonism as well. Why don't we just take a second? Are there any other categories that inform your engagement with the church? One that comes to mind is just spiritual.
Sure. Yeah, we really haven't talked about that, have we?
Are you spiritually edified at church or as a Mormon?
Yeah, definitely. Both. Yeah, at church and as a Mormon. Not all the time in either category. And there's definitely moments of one of my favorite movies of any sort of recent years is Silence, the Martin Scorsese film Silence. I don't know if you've seen that one, John.
I've not seen it. No, I've heard about it. Out. Isn't
not
it like
many people saw
Japanese monks? Is that right?
Yeah. So it's about European missionaries who go to Japan to convert Japanese people, and it's about Japanese Christians and about the the experiences that they have. But it's thematically, it's larger. It's largely about the idea of God's silence and an idea about apostasy and what it means to respect God and what it means to respect God, sometimes even through defying the tangible icons of God that you might have as a church or in church. And but it also deals with just the long stretches of time when a very devout person might experience the silence of God. And so I really resonated a lot with that a lot, because throughout my life, I have had moments and periods, stretches of time where I have felt very close to what I would imagine as God, and I very close to spirituality and spiritual light. And at other times I haven't. And those periods really don't correlate very much with like how obedient I am being necessarily. It's just, I think sometimes the way that I understand God, I think sometimes there's just silence that is part of the thing. And so, yes, my life, yeah, I've had many times that God has meant something or other to me at different times. If that makes sense.
Yeah. But are there parts of your lived experience that spiritually edify you, like hymns or teaching the kids, or would you say that it's spiritually edifying, or at times?
Yeah. So I would say something that I really practiced on my mission was, I guess maybe a way to say this would be listening to the Spirit, or trying to listen to the Spirit through a lens of integrity and through a lens of trying to really be internal with myself, listening as carefully to myself as to some whatever external spirit might be. And I think both are hard to hear, and both are based on sort of my own constructs in my mind, of course. But I have had many times, including many times recently, of just a feeling of direction or of comfort. But yeah, not comfort, yes, but really direction, where I feel inspired to do something or to say something. I was inspired to share my testimony yesterday at church, and I really did feel something within me.
I had asked you about your spiritual edification as a Mormon, and the last thing I remember hearing is that sometimes you feel like you receive guidance or direction or inspiration, through your engagement with Mormonism or through the church. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I would say so. So certainly my engagement with the church is what is the framework that I view it, but who knows what it is. I feel like I'm a spiritual person, and I have tapped into that. I was mentioning just before we cut off about how as a student in my biology class at BYU, the stuff that we were talking about evolution and about just life really inspired me and filled me with wonder. And so it's not just, of course that was a BYU context, but it was just pure, straight, real science, it was just biology. And I felt just as much edification in that as in, a church meeting, or as I mentioned, I'm very interested in the arts, and I have been moved by films and by novels in ways that mirror the ways in which I've been moved and inspired at church. So it's all, I see the Mormon aspect of it is just because that's the lens that I see everything. But I seek inspiration and spiritual light kind of wherever I can get it, and I can find it in various places.
So this idea of supplementing, you supplement whatever spiritual edification you get from Mormonism with lots of other sources.
Well, in a very Mormon way, I don't really think of it as supplementing. I just think of it, Mormonism is the lens, and I just will learn whatever I can from wherever I can learn it,
Yeah, and you can probably find quotes from Joseph Smith or Gordon B. Hinckley about drawing on truth and wisdom from wherever it comes. Is that right? Sure.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. So the idea with this segment was to sort of look at categories that I had left out of my framework, from being misled or deceived, to being stuck or trapped, to uh, you know, staying in to help make the church better, or what was the third? Oh, or not being sensitive to those who
Right.
experience pain or suffering. You added tribalism, you know, being a tribal identity Mormon, and you offered spirituality. Are there any other major categories that sort of try to captivate why you remain engaged?
Well, only to say that, and part of the impetus for me adding to the conversation initially in that Facebook post was to just say, I think categories are useful and as I think we've had a great discussion so far talking about the various categories that you outlined and how those all apply. But I also just think, I don't know, categorization is often reductive, and that from the Mormons that I know, I'm not sure that I fully understand well enough, or presume to understand well enough why they're Mormon. I just think there's lots of Mormons and there's lots of way to be Mormon. And so yeah, I think the categories we've talked about are good, and I can't really think of any other broader ones. But I would just throw that caveat that the idea of categorization itself may be suspect in some ways.
Sure. Because it never fully captures any one human experience.
Sure.
But I do think, can I push back a little bit and say, aren't there people trapped? Aren't there people misled? Like, can't these categories be useful in categorizing people's experiences, just maybe not in a comprehensive way?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, it's both. Okay.